Let's just get the sums right first before we start talking about this parable. So the first servant, the steward, he owes his master, the king, 10,000 talents. 10,000 talents. This is an astronomical sum. It is billions and billions of pounds. And just for a point of reference, I read yesterday, it is 10 times the annual income of King Herod at the time. So big bucks, as they say in America. 100 denarii, this is what the other servant owed to the big servant. 100 denarii, it's 4 months' wages. Let's just say it's a few thousand pounds. Maybe it's 8, 9, 10,000 pounds in terms of typical wages today. So it's not nothing, but it's not a kingdom. Now, we're not meant to overanalyze this story, sitting there thinking, how's it possible? How did he owe him that? Who would be stupid enough to lend him that much money? This is a parable, okay? It's not an MBA case study on financial mismanagement. There is a simple point. You don't overanalyze parables. The simple point, someone is forgiven a huge debt and he refuses to give a much smaller debt. Very simple. Okay. But with that story and that simplicity in mind, what's it all about, this beautiful, unsettling parable? Well, first of all, it's about the generosity and the compassion of God. We owe God everything. Absolutely everything. There is nothing we have done wrong that can keep us away from Him. And there's nothing we have that is not from Him. As long as we come back to Him, honestly and humbly, whatever has happened, whatever seems to be keeping us away from Him, whatever debt we owe Him, nothing is too big for Him, no problem too difficult. This is the size of God's love and the tenderness and the compassion that He has for each one of us. He's the Master who forgives debts. He's the Father who waits for the prodigal son. He's the Good Shepherd who seeks out the lost, however broken they are, however far away they seem to be. A God of mercy and compassion, slow to anger and rich in mercy. That refrain that we hear again and again in the Old Testament. We owe everything to God, and there is nothing He hasn't given us. Just look behind me on the sanctuary wall. Our beautiful, tender crucifix. God gave His only Son to us. That's the extent of His love. And that's just a little glimpse into this from the parable today. The generosity and the compassion of God. It's also about, though, there's the big truth. It's about appreciating what we have. This man, his debt is forgiven, it's huge. What does he have then? He has his freedom back, his family, his life. And immediately, do you notice, he forgets about what he has and he obsesses about what others owe to him. This is a man who's caught up in what he doesn't have instead of what he does have. He's not grateful. He's not, that lovely word, appreciative. It means literally to appreciate, to know the value of the treasure, the gifts that you've been given. I heard a lovely story on the radio yesterday, on Pause for Thought, a Sufi tale. There is a man who is well off and doing okay and everything's fine, but he's just not happy. He's not joyful. He knows something is missing. So he takes all his possessions, all his worldly possessions, in a big sack, and he carries them on his shoulder. in search of the Sufi master to find an answer. The Sufi master is sitting under his tree, and the man tells his story of woe. I'm just not happy. Something is missing from my life. And the Sufi master, he looks at him very carefully, pauses, and then he snatches his bag off him and runs away. And the man chases after him, and he's confused, and there's consternation, and there's befuddlement, and then there's anger, and then there's rage when he runs faster than him and he can't catch him. And he goes back to the tree, heartbroken, and sits there and falls asleep. And when he wakes up the next morning, his bag of worldly possessions is hanging on a branch from the tree, and the Sufi master is sitting next to him. And he's overjoyed. He is absolutely in love with the Sufi master, in love with life, in love with God, and he is just full of the joys of spring, and he could not be happier because he has got back what he'd lost. And of course, what does the Sufi master say to him? Have you got any more than you had 24 hours ago before you met me? No. He's got exactly what he had before, only he lost it and it was given back to him, so he could appreciate it as if it were for the first time. And the moral on the radio of the story was, we need to learn to, another lovely English word, I don't know how you translate it into all your different languages, we need to learn to cherish what we do have instead of mourning what we don't have. The story of the tale. And just to make it very real, on Friday night I was sitting down with a friend who rides a motorbike, and a year ago his right shoulder had been completely smashed up in an accident, very serious actually, and for 6 months he could not use his right hand. He couldn't lift his hand more than 6 inches. And he'd been into hospital quite recently, and he'd had a new shoulder. I don't know the level of the bionicness that's in his right shoulder now. And he just sat in front of me, lifting his shoulder up like this, like a 6-year-old child with a new toy. And I said, well, yes. The point, and he said it to me, just how we don't appreciate the things that we have until we lose them. And wouldn't it be nice if we could appreciate them before we lost them, instead of having to go through those experiences? I think there's something of that in the parable today. To be grateful for what we have. How much a first year at university needs to have that said to them, instead of mourning or being frustrated or angry about what you don't have. Okay, but what else is here? Let's go a little bit deeper. In terms of psychology in this parable. This parable, of course, is partly about hypocrisy, or, put it another way, consistency. The man wants forgiveness himself. Great. He gets it. He doesn't want to offer it to others. And we laugh at him and we think, well, you hypocrite. You fool. And we kind of rejoice in the punishment he gets at the end. He can't see it. But are you any different? Really? Am I any different? In about 17 minutes' time, I'm going to ask you to stand up and say in public and in the face of Almighty God these words: forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Basically, we're going to pray the Lord's Prayer together, as we always do at Mass. Do you really mean those words? Do you really want to say them? Do you want God to forgive you to the extent that you are willing to forgive others? Do you really want to make that prayer? Or would you rather put your head down and stay silent for that little bit of the Lord's Prayer? Because it's a challenge. The measure of how God forgives us is how we forgive others. It's a bold prayer. Sometimes we say, preachers say, and I've said this myself, oh, God's forgiveness and mercy is unconditional. What I mean is, it's half true, there are no limits. You never need to be afraid of coming back to God. Nothing you've done, as I said a few minutes ago, can separate you from the love of God. Nothing. In that sense, it's unconditional. But it's not strictly true to say that God's forgiveness is unconditional, because that's not what the Lord tells us. He says, if we refuse to forgive others, and make it a bit more concrete and simple, if we hold on to resentments and grudges, if we dismiss others, if we hate others for what they've done to us, if we don't give them space and forgiveness and welcome and a second chance and a third chance, and as Peter wants to say, a seventh chance, and as Jesus says at the beginning of this gospel today, a 77th chance, if we don't do that, we can't hold our hearts open to the Lord and say, I expect and pray for your own forgiveness to me. That's the challenge. And it's not just about not being hypocrites, although that's an important thing. It's something deeply theological and true about what it means for us to be children of God. We want to be forgiven, to be brought into the family of God's love. And it's not that God is saying, oh, I'm not going to give you that if you're a hypocrite. It's the Lord saying, but if you really understand what it means to be brought into the family of God, to be brothers and sisters of one another, to be my son or daughter, that doesn't make sense. That's not possible if you're not willing to live that brotherliness and sisterliness, that mercy and forgiveness with others. It's not just a rule, it's a reality. If this is what we want, this mercy, we have to receive it and give it. And we can't do one without the other. And I'd say a last little thing about the parable, and I'm saying this because we're starting the new academic year. I think this parable is also about looking after the little people. Looking after the little people. The servant has a big debt and he's forgiven. This is the world of power politics and high finance. He is a big cheese, yeah? But the little person, the little servant, who owes just a few £1,000s, a few 100 denarii, this little person is trampled upon and forgotten. They don't matter in the eyes of the big servant. Notice the little people. Notice others. Notice the people on the edges. Because we ought to, because we're called to as Christians. But back to the depths of this parable, because if we don't notice the little people, God might not notice us. You see why I'm saying this in Freshers Week? You, all of you, especially you who are starting out, you have a special mission to look out for others in the next few weeks. I know lots of you are a bit nervous and shy here in London, here in your college, here in Newman House even, I guess. And you're thinking, how can I be happy? How can I make friends? How can I make a success of this year? They're good thoughts. I'm not judging you for having those thoughts. But equally important is how can you help others to be happy and help them to have a good year? I'm challenging you really. Please, especially in the next 2 or 3 weeks, take a risk that you wouldn't normally take. Notice the people around you. Don't just start talking to someone and thinking, oh, thank God I found a friend. I'm really happy you found a friend, really. It's what the chaplaincy is about. But don't look at that friend obsessively and forget the other 100 people in the room and the other 350,000 students in our diocese starting this week. I'm challenging you to talk to the people you don't know, to notice them, to go out of the way just to have a conversation, to say hello, to ask their name, to invite them to things, to have some great time with the person you've just met. Talk to them, swap Facebook messages and phone numbers, but make sure you're also attentive to the people who are alone and stuck and about to leave because no one's talking to them and maybe very looking happy and bubbly, but needing your friendship and your support. Don't use the excuse, I'm shy. You might feel shy, but actually to say I'm shy is a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Because actually, if you say to yourself, I'm not shy, and go and talk to someone, it'll stop you being shy. Yeah. Be brave. Take a risk. Do it for love of other people, but do it above all for yourself. Because the Lord wants you to be his beloved son and daughter. He wants to love you and bless you this year. But he does that through you being a blessing to others, and through you being a brother and sister to those around you. The measure of your success and happiness this year is how much you are willing to help others in their success and happiness. I think that's partly the message of the parable, and it's certainly a good message for Freshers' Week.